How many of you saw or heard the title of my speech and thought, this doesn't apply to me? Well, if you think that you don't negotiate very much, if at all, let me tell you that I think you're really missing the boat. Negotiation is ubiquitous. We negotiate formally, but also informally every day. At work with our bosses, coworkers, and clients. At home with our parents, spouses, and certainly our kids who often appear to be master negotiators. And in the world around us with companies when we disagree with a bill or when we're buying a home. So I hope you can see that what I'm about to talk to you about is very relevant to all of you out there. Now, the subject of this talk is how we negotiate and connect with others, which is changing dramatically. What was once done face-to-face in a boardroom or at the car dealer is now done via text, email, telephone, or video conferencing. In other words, we're increasingly becoming wired negotiators, and the impact of technology on our negotiations is significant. To show you how prevalent the use of technology is in negotiation, I want to share two examples with you. The first is how the use of email got in the way of a negotiation that had all the signs of success, only to end in frustration and failure. The second is a negotiation via text, in what I'm sure you'll agree is a pretty extraordinary context. So with regard to the email negotiation, the story begins with a woman only known as W. W posted a negotiation she had on a higher education blog about a tenure-track job that she was offered at a small liberal arts college. She responded to the initial offer via email by asking for a few things that would be normal in these kinds of negotiations. Among some of the things that she asked for were an increase in pay to the industry standard, time to finish her postdoc, and a semester of maternity leave in the future. She ended the email by saying, I know some of these things might be easier to grant than others, so let me know what you think. The university responded also via email by thanking her for her note, explaining that the dean and the vice president for academic affairs had reviewed her requests and they were no longer interested in hiring her. That was it. The negotiations came to a screeching halt. So it seems like this is a pretty premature ending to this story, doesn't it? Now, what do you think would have happened had the negotiation been done in person? You probably reached the same conclusion as me, which is that I think they would have been able to clarify a few things and perhaps reach some way forward. Okay, let's switch gears to the next example from, of all places, a hostage negotiation. So the year was 2011. The place was Kalamazoo, Michigan. A suspect in a gas station robbery fled and led the police on a high-speed chase. Police officer Andres Wells pursued but was unprepared for what would happen next. The suspect, who threatened suicide, began ignoring Wells' phone calls and instead sent him a text. In his 3 years as a hostage negotiator, Wells had never even considered the idea of negotiating via text. After the initial message where the suspect asked the police to contact his girlfriend, he ceased any communication. But as Wells continued typing, the suspect finally asked for a bottle of water. Wells' partner got the bottle of water and threw it into the suspect's open car window per his request. Now, the throw wasn't a great one, and so Wells texted the suspect, joking that the officer had a weak arm. The suspect sent back a smiley face emoji, and Wells knew he had a breakthrough. The suspect eventually agreed to accept a phone call, and 15 minutes later, after some intense negotiations on the phone, the suspect surrendered. Now, these are just a couple of examples of the role of technology in negotiation. But I want to show you the full range of mediums to keep in mind as you engage in virtual negotiations, and then we'll talk about when you might want to pursue each and why. One helpful way to think about the different wired mediums is on a continuum from high to low media richness. So media richness is a framework for explaining communications with respect to social clues, such as facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language. Those mediums that are low in media richness, such as text and email, are devoid of many of the clues that you might find in higher rich mediums, such as video conferencing. Also note that lower rich mediums are mainly asynchronous, meaning that messages are communicated intermittently. Higher rich mediums tend to be more synchronous, which means that they happen in real time with immediate back and forth. So when I think of using these different mediums in my negotiations, I ask myself which would be most appropriate and why. But just like Officer Wells, I also see them in terms of a sequence, where I might begin a negotiation with a less rich medium, such as email, and if I run into a problem, then I'll switch over to a higher rich medium, such as the telephone. Now, generally speaking, there are benefits to the different types of negotiations, as well as downsides. So let's look at low rich mediums first and the positives and negatives, and then we'll do the same for higher rich mediums. So on the upside, lower rich mediums, particularly text and email, give people time to respond due to their asynchronous nature. And they can actually empower people who find face-to-face negotiations anxiety-producing. There's something about being behind a smartphone or a keyboard that really enables people to assert more effectively for themselves, sometimes a little too effective. But I guess not having to see the anger, angst, or frustration on the face of the other negotiator helps a lot. Negotiators can also step away between text and emails to think more clearly about the implications of an offer, and to search for information on the web that might assist them during that negotiation. So I was recently engaged in an email negotiation with a car dealer about selling our car, and they made an offer to me that I felt was pretty low. And I was able to search a number of different websites to make certain of that fact. In the end, we didn't reach an agreement, but that was actually a good thing because it wasn't the best deal for me. Now, the ability to step away and not respond in the moment can also help people to manage their emotions. There's considerable research that clearly suggests that a failure to manage one's emotions in negotiation is one of the biggest mistakes that we make, and leads to all kinds of problems, such as giving away more than we should. With tools such as the Save as Draft button in email, we can create the needed space and time to manage our emotional reactions effectively. And finally, text and email negotiations leave a paper trail that can really help with disagreements or psychological barriers, such as selective recall, where people remember only what they want to remember and what fits into the narrative. Last year, I was engaged in an email negotiation with a client, and we disagreed about an issue that I thought we had settled. Because we had the email trail, we were able to clarify the issue productively and go back and figure it all out. Now, the downside are that you lose a lot of social clues when you're interacting in this way. And in particular, nonverbal clues that make up a substantial part of communication. By some estimates, up to 93% of our communication fall into this category, can be really costly and lead to flaming and insults, escalation, and a premature breakdown of the negotiation process, as we saw with W. Furthermore, if you don't check your assumptions and perceptions frequently, the rule with low rich mediums is, if it can be misinterpreted, it will be. Finally, negotiation with text and email tend to be more focused on bargaining or dividing the pie and less on finding creative solutions and expanding it. Some of this has to do with the lack of ability to build rapport with the other negotiator in these mediums, and rapport is quite important because it builds trust and the sharing of information, which leads to more value creation. Now, as we move across the spectrum to higher rich mediums, we find that there are a number of positives as well. We can hold more negotiations with less time involved due to the synchronous nature of telephone or video conferencing. Telephone conveys about 45% of our communication abilities due to the inclusion of tone of voice and the ability to sort of quote unquote hear the other's emotions. Video conferencing gets us much closer to our full 100% of our communication ability, really because it replicates many of the dynamics of face-to-face negotiations, especially humanizing the process by seeing the other and bringing back into the picture nonverbal aspects and tone of voice previously mentioned. And video conferencing has many other benefits because it eliminates travel, making this medium far less costly while still enabling people to negotiate globally. Over the past few years, I've worked with many companies and businesses that have dealings around the world, and they've saved a tremendous amount of time, money, and effort negotiating this way. Now, of course, there are also downsides with high rich mediums related to relationship building, privacy, and security, particularly when it comes to video conferencing. So when it comes to relationship building, there are many cultures around the world that feel most comfortable after having met in person at least just once. And if that doesn't really happen, it's hard to trust the other, and video conferencing doesn't really help you there. I did work for many years on a project in the Middle East that required a lot of virtual work and negotiation. And while we could engage adequately via video conferencing, I absolutely noticed a difference once we had actually met in person. Now, with regard to privacy and security in video conferencing, we never know who might be lurking out of screen view or who might be listening in from another location. And that puts us in some jeopardy because when we do share information, we don't know what's going to happen to it. Other downsides of high-rich mediums are that not everyone has equal access to them, particularly in developing countries around the world. And there are still many people who are not very savvy using video conference, which again puts them at a disadvantage because of that discomfort. Now, you might be wondering at this point, all of this is well and good, but how do I know when to use which mediums? So I'm very glad you asked that. So to help you that, I need to add two other dimensions to the equation that we've talked about so far. Namely, the type of negotiation you're engaging in and the nature of the relationship we have with the other negotiator. So why is that important? Well, when we review the research on negotiation and the use of different mediums and their ultimate impact on negotiated outcomes, the picture is less than clear. So some studies suggest that when negotiators can see each other, their chances for success increase. While other studies have shown that the relationship between the parties is what's important, and the medium is just secondary. But researchers from the Kellogg School at Northwestern University were able to offer us some useful advice. They share three important rules of thumb to keep in mind. So the first is that in negotiations with no past relationships, high-rich mediums increase the likelihood of achieving high-quality outcomes. Second, when negotiators have a positive relationship and are more likely to cooperate, the medium doesn't significantly impact the outcome. In other words, pick whichever medium is comfortable for you in your context. And third, low-rich mediums decrease the likelihood of high-quality outcomes when negotiators have a history of vitriol or when they're in a competitive mode and seeking personal gain without concern for the other negotiator. So, the next time you go into a negotiation, whether it be trying to get your cable bill lowered, texting with your spouse over where to go for dinner, or negotiating with a client halfway around the world, you don't need to shy away from being a wired negotiator. In fact, just the opposite. If you know yourself clearly, understand the relationship you have with the other negotiator, and use the right mediums for your wired negotiations, there are numerous benefits to be had no matter how you connect. Just remember to avoid the pitfalls that lurk in the cyber world that can put you at a distinct disadvantage. Thank you.